Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Beth Ann Gerstein, and I'm the Executive Director of AMOCA. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Before I introduce Nicole, I'd like to thank Dave Armstrong and his team for their help in installing the exhibition. I'd also like to thank Pam Aliaga, who is our new exhibition manager, and Paul Roach, our newly married Director of Advancement and Communications and videographer, and all the members and donors of AMOCA who make these kinds of programs possible. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our two artist-in-residence who are here today, Kirsten Wilders and Colby Charpentier. Raise your hands so people know who you are. Our Artist-in-Residence program is funded through support from the Wingate Foundation, Julianne and David Armstrong, and Laguna Clay and Glaze Company. So special thanks to them for helping to make that program possible. As you sit here in our beautifully gutted space, we think it's beautiful. We're really excited that there's going to be a new education space that'll look a whole lot better than this. There'll be a collection study room where you're currently sitting. There'll be a kids maker space and new exhibition prep, and most importantly, new bathrooms. So we're very excited about that. We hope by next summer that everything will be completed. Also in the education space, we're restoring a very large John Mason sculpture that'll be installed on the back wall permanently of the new education space. We've already raised about $850,000. We still have about $300,000 to go. So if anybody wants to get involved, you just let Paul or myself know. And now I'd like to introduce Nicole. Nicole Seisler is a Los Angeles-based ceramic artist who creates sculpture, installation, and public art that investigate time, materiality, process, and overlapping roles of artist, viewer, and participant, and collaborator. She's shown at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Tallahassee, and Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, and Craft Contemporary in LA. Nicole received her MFA from the School of Art in Chicago, and a BFA from the School of Museum Fine Arts in Boston. She's taught ceramics at the University of Washington, UCLA, and she was the Lincoln Visiting Professor of Ceramics at Scripps College. Seisler is the director of the Los Angeles Contemporary Ceramics Gallery, AB Projects, where she has curated more than 30 exhibitions and other programming on ceramics. And with that said, I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Nicole Seisler.
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me. If anybody can't hear me, you can let me know. I'm gonna kind of chill on this here stool. You're saying it looks very professorial here with my lamp. You can see my other work in the floor over there that Alice pointed out, and Stan pointed out my other work on the wall here. I have some notes here that I'm gonna kind of use, but you should also consider this to be a pretty casual talk and conversation. So if you have questions, feel free to kind of raise your hand and let me know. What am I gonna talk about? I'm gonna talk a little bit about my show, Holding Patterns, and I'm also gonna talk a little bit about what has happened since then. So, Holding Patterns is actually the last body of work that I completed before the pandemic. So I'm gonna talk about that, and then I'm gonna talk about what pandemic has kind of meant for my practice more broadly, and how it's kind of evolved and been affected by our last year and a half, almost 2 years now, and kind of where things are at right now. I'm sure I'm gonna forget some things and maybe miss some pieces, so again, just go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question at any point. So just to give like the basics of how the work was made in the show, each of those pieces is made from a single slab of clay. So I would stretch a slab of clay, and then I would kind of task myself with making a shelf out of that slab. And then all of the pieces that were cut off of that, as they always are when you work with slabs and clay, there's always offcuts and pieces that you toss to the side, or they become piled up, or they get recycled, but they're usually ignored. They're not the thing that you're working on. And so my goal was to kind of elevate those discarded elements, or to give more credit and respect to those parts of the process that we typically discard. And so the function of each shelf really became to present, to hold, to kind of highlight the discarded parts of itself. So in that way, like really thinking about how to value kind of the residue of process, or to look at kind of every step that happens along the way to making so-called the work, and to also give those steps value and respect and kind of credence. So this work, like I said, was made, I mean, now a little while ago, although it doesn't feel like that long ago to me in terms of its actual making. But I made it in the summer of 2019 when I was in residence at Ash Street Project in Portland, Oregon, which is run by Thomas Orr and Joanna Bloom. And you know, I had been kind of sketching in my studio, and I knew kind of the direction that I was going in and how I was going to spend my 3 weeks while I was up there. But my drive up the coast also really influenced the making of that work. So driving from here to Portland, it was really a process of slow observation, which I think is when my work is often at its best, when I am in a place where I can really slowly observe. That drive was a process of kind of observing my own holding, my own letting go and accumulation, a process of watching and doing things you might expect, like holding rocks and sand, and watching patterns in water, and unabashedly hugging giant trees, and observing like how the increasing green of driving up the coast. And it's really that drive and that experience of the landscape that influenced the color palette of the work, that really deep reddish brown, and then the green glaze in it. And I'm not a big user of glaze typically in my work, but the green felt really important in that way. So being at Ash Street was actually kind of like the perfect condition for making this body of work. As I said, I'd been kind of sketching in my studio, making small scale versions and experiments. So I kind of knew like what the process was that I wanted to dive into. And then for 3 weeks, I basically found myself in this very glorious pattern where I would wake up in the morning and I would walk to the studio, something that I can't do in Los Angeles, which I miss. It was I was like, wow, I haven't been a pedestrian for a really long time. Experiencing the city felt really different. But you know, I get to walk to the studio, grab my coffee, get right to work, and then Ash Street Project has a really beautiful practice of having a daily communal lunch, and it's kind of brown bag. Anybody can come by with their lunch, and we sit at a big table, and we come together as a group, and then we disperse again and back to making all day. I would walk home, I would have a nice meal, and I would just kind of be in my sketchbooks really for the rest of the night. And then I was just on repeat for a few weeks. And it was a really amazing kind of like flow state to be in with the work, where since I kind of knew the process that I wanted to be in, that also became yet another kind of pattern that I was in. And it allowed me to really kind of observe the process and be absorbed myself into the work. And it's really out of that pattern that the work accumulated. It was a place where I had total free reign of the studio. So, I mean, this got into such a flow state that I couldn't even remember what I had in the kiln anymore. It was like every day something new. Okay, put it in the kiln, fire that thing. Thomas Orr likes to say that, you know, fire like a grandma. He's like, I like to fire like a grandma. I'm like, I do too. So I'd be firing these super slow firings, and so everything was just kind of in its own cycle, whether it was in my hands or on the studio table or in the gallery. So at that time, I was also installing the work in their gallery, and I was kind of merging the idea of gallery and studio. So the gallery really just became an extension of the studio. And all the work was kind of prepared in there. I was wedging the clay on the walls, I was stretching the slabs on the walls, all this evidence of the making was accumulating, and then the work would slowly accumulate in the space as well. So I'd kind of just watch this growth over time. And, you know, you think a lot about like the residue of a process or what gets left behind, especially if you're traveling or somewhere that isn't your own space, like what are you gonna leave behind? What are you gonna take with you? But really what happened was that there was basically never any extraneous residue. All the residue was included in the work. It's all supported in the work. Every little crumb, essentially. Everything was valued and brought back into the work. So, you know, with all of these offcuts or kind of things that we might typically discard, they would pile up and then I would glaze fuse them back onto the shelves. And so everything was included, everything was visible. And part of my goal, both in the studio and my process of working and in the work itself, was to be transparent. That felt really important to me. Not just kind of an honesty in materials, but an honesty in what I'm thinking about, how I'm choosing to work, what I'm really embedding into the work. And the mind map the thoughts on holding patterns, it really comes from that place. So in that mind map, it includes thoughts that developed in a previous installation I had done prior to making that work, things that came up for me while I was making the work, really many different things that, you know, I have this kind of ongoing practice of making mind maps, and I have like sketchbooks that are dedicated just to making mind maps. It's a really old practice for me that I learned in high school, you know, when I was learning like essay writing, but has really stuck, and in the last 5 years has become a much more prominent part of my practice, and sometimes to the point where mind maps have started to replace essays even when I'm writing about other people's work. So it's kind of a way of being really transparent, including a lot of thoughts and letting people explore that for themselves. There was a lot of unpredictability in that work, and I kind of gave myself a lot of permission to trust the process and not put too many expectations on myself and just let myself kind of be absorbed into that. So all of the work is over-fired. It's a pretty low to kind of medium clay body that I fired quite high in the kiln, knowing that it would bloat sometimes or slump and do things that I didn't have control over. There are some pieces that broke and then I would just glaze them back together. There's also a lot of pieces that were just allowed to crumble and kind of exist in the state that they exist in. And, you know, pieces that were fired and then perhaps broke. And I think, you know, we think so much about the fired state of ceramics as the final state. You know, that's it. That's how it's going to exist forever in permanence. But I like this idea that it's okay if something cracks, that too might be able to be part of the process. And even when I installed the work here, you know, the walls in the vault are very sturdy walls with some hardwood backing. And so there's definitely some cracking that occurred with the installation of the work. And, you know, I'm in a place where I want that to be okay, instead of that being wrong or something that needs to be fixed. You know, and if clay or if these objects are really kind of a proxy for the self, then it seems particularly important that cracking might not just be okay, but might be something that we could embrace as well. So shifting gears a little bit, but thinking about cracking, I would say that the pandemic has caused a lot of cracking, global cracking, personal cracking, fissures everywhere. You know, after I made that work, I was working on some other things as well, some other projects that are kind of still somewhat in research phases or have come out in different ways. But when the pandemic hit, I mean, I think like it was for most of you, it was incredibly shocking. I was certainly shocked. My students were certainly shocked. I think most of us were in shock. And, in thinking about what we value, things that might normally be discarded or fall off to the side, I think that the pandemic has made a lot of us kind of take stock in what we value and brought our values into stark light. Whether that it was human rights or health or safety, like these things that are the most important things. And I think that, in the early pandemic, making art for me really paled in comparison to any of those things. It didn't feel important. Talking about ceramics didn't feel important. Who cares about ceramics? There's a global pandemic. Conversing about art or having critical conversations about clay just no longer had urgency or weight or significant meaning for me in that context. And I was teaching at the time, and all of my teaching really became a conduit for understanding and processing what was happening in the world, and using clay not to produce a product, but really to observe that process, as I was talking about in my own work. And out of that was born a book. In December, I published a book called Recipes for Clay, for Conceptual Clay, in the time of COVID-19. These are all exercises that I did with my students that were a way of reflecting on the circumstances that were happening in the pandemic, but through clay. So I think a lot of the pandemic for me has been looking for new ways to put the pieces back together, or to think about what the pieces even are, the ones that are familiar to us, the ones that are new pieces, to figure out where they might fit. And the pandemic, as we all are aware, abruptly halted what we considered normal to be. And I think in many ways that was very crushing, but I think that also a lot of things needed to shift. And if cracks formed and there were shards and remnants and residue, my question has started to become more what can be formed from that. So, Beth Ann mentioned that I also run a gallery called AB Projects. I've been running that space for 6 years. And there was an exhibition that went up right before the pandemic by Phoebe Cummings, which was all ephemeral raw clay work. And ironically, that became AB Projects and Phoebe's longest running show ever for 17 months. So this work that's meant to not exist anymore, that was existing perfectly intact for a really long time. And so, I didn't hold new exhibitions because honestly, it didn't feel important. All these other things just felt more important. And so in considering how to build anew without necessarily rebuilding, really thinking about what else can be built, I was really thinking about what my broader community might need or benefit from through this time. And although at first, when it was so shocking in the beginning and it didn't feel like art making or ceramics that I'm so passionate about really had that relevancy anymore, it started to come back, and I know that people wanted to be in dialogue. So a year ago in October, I kind of brought that collective dialogue back through AB Projects, through State of Ceramics, which is a conversation series that I was running prior to the pandemic, but it would be held in the gallery or in my studio, which is behind the gallery. And then that shifted online and obviously into a more global community. And so, you all know you've been on Zooms with people in many different countries, but it is pretty amazing that suddenly this conversation about ceramics went from being a conversation I had in Los Angeles to a conversation with people in India and Qatar and Australia and France and Sweden and the UK and India. I said India, it's pretty phenomenal that we can connect with each other across boundaries, geographic boundaries in that way. And so, again, in order for a critical discourse about ceramics to feel relevant, at least to me, I felt like it needed to reflect upon our human condition. And again, this kind of relates back to the work in the gallery because I'm thinking about my own human condition through that work. But in these kind of critical dialogues, my question was, how to reflect upon what our human condition is. So over the course of 6 State of Ceramics conversations, and sometimes there would be 30 people in these, sometimes 70 people, I held 2 series. One was called Our Clay Bodies, and that was really thinking about how, in the pandemic, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, it felt like everything related to our bodies, whether that was the disease or our health or political bodies or the color of our bodies. Everything seemed to be so central, or the distance between our bodies, it was so immediate. So I was paralleling that with our clay bodies and kind of how we can reflect upon that through that materiality. And then the next series was Incomplete Histories in Contemporary Ceramics, which was thinking about all of the things that we don't look at in the history of ceramics. We all know the classic history of really heroic white men ceramics, and there's so much that's left out in so many different facets. So a lot of that was trying to kind of fill some of those gaps. And all of that became part of this .edu edition, which was filled with educational resources. So kind of like the book that I had written, but I was working with the artists who were leading these conversations. So Kathy Liu and Andres Peana-Estrada, Sigrid Espelin, Chanupa Hanska-Luger, Kitty Ross, Kari Marbo, were all working with me to develop exercises, resources, and all of that's on the website for educators to be able to use with their students as well. At that point, I think a lot of what I was thinking about was how to reconnect with my community. And I think, again, this idea of kind of reconnecting or holding is evident in the work and the show as well. But I think during the pandemic, my own making practice really slowed a lot. I made a lot of functional work for my home. I made shelves whose function were to hold things like cups as opposed to their own residue. I made plant pots. I made things that seemed like they had a purpose in the home. But I really began to miss having conversations about my work and conversations about other people's work. And I really missed being around new objects. There was a dark time, deep in the height of pandemic, where I went to the beach and was like, look at these rocks. These rocks are amazing. Wow, I was just desperate for objects, because I'm used to being around objects all the time and talking about objects. And I think a lot of us are. And so I realized that particularly in our isolation, a lot of us needed new seeds in our practice, or a boost of energy, or momentum, or a jump start, or a new way of approaching our work. So in January, I started offering what I call studio sessions. And these are online, and they're a place for up to 10 people at a time to gather under the guidance of a lead artist who develops a topic that we all talk about and experiment around. So it's kind of like a jam session of sorts, or what I imagine a jam session would be like if I were a musician, which I'm absolutely not. Where there's kind of improvisation and discussion and hands in clay and new things happening and experiments. And again, it's really process-oriented, not outcome-oriented. And that's been a way to broaden community and to really think deeply about topics that are important to other people in their practices. So working with artists like Phoebe Cummings and Nathan Lynch, Kitty Ross again, Magdalene Dykstra, Ashwini Bhatt, who has the show After Me in the Vault, Kristen Morgan, Stacey Jo Scott, Kathy Liu, Sarah Christie, Sharon Norwood, Desiree Corral, Jia Zhang. All of these people kind of coming together and opening up new avenues to think about clay in these different ways. This has been a lot of my practice during the pandemic, is kind of figuring out a new format for how to bring people together when being in the same space continues to still be problematic, even though we're able to do this, which I'm really grateful for. And I think, I've been teaching in higher ed for 10 years. I've been teaching ceramics for a long time. But as higher ed continued to fissure and my own job security became really unstable, I decided to start taking these pieces that I was kind of collecting and accumulated into something larger. So again, very much the same process that I work in through clay, but working with these other kind of non-object ideas. So the State of Ceramics conversations and the studio sessions have really become these building blocks for building this something even larger. So last month I launched the ABCC, which is the AB Project Ceramics Certificate. And that's a year-long program geared towards anybody who's committed to deepening their practice in clay or their relationship to clay. And it's kind of like an alternative to a post-bac certificate in a way. It's an accessible and affordable education in conceptual ceramics. I'm doing this with a cohort of people who continue to build, and kind of like an alternative to the norm. It's a non-hierarchical approach to shared and lateral learning, and a different model for education that presents an academic and conceptual approach to ceramics that usually is only accessible in very select universities, and even then can be really difficult to come by. But now can be done in one's own studio. And you know, I think about like so much of education during this time has been trying to like go back to normal. Everybody wants to go back to normal. And I'm not that interested in going back to normal. You know, I'm really interested in like what else we can form out of these pieces. Like if all of the residue is useful, if all of it is valuable, how do we shift the dynamic? How do we create something new, something a little bit different, instead of mimicking what we had before? So I've been thinking about that really deeply and broadly, especially in the context of education, in the context of my gallery. But I have clearly mentioned that process is really important to me, and my own making process is kind of playing catch up to this other process. So while I've been able to think about these pieces in this broad spectrum in terms of community and education, it's a little bit slower in my own making process. And where I'm at right now is that I'm kind of repurposing about 10 years of remnants in my own studio and materials that I've been classically, as the artist that I am, like dragging around with me as I've moved from city to city, where I'm like, this fabric is so cool. So like, but I haven't used it for anything for like 7 years, but it's so amazing. So I just keep taking these boxes with me. And so I've been valuing all of those kinds of remnants in the studio, but it's actually time, I think, to kind of wipe the slate clean and think about how to rebuild or build anew in that way. So if anybody's looking to purchase art objects or get your hands on some super cool free materials like glitter vinyl, on October 30th, I'm gonna have a sale and a free-for-all in my studio. And then in the new year, I'm actually leading my own studio session through AB Projects that's on the topic of residue. Something that obviously is directly inspired by the holding patterns that are on view here, and from all of these things that have kind of transpired for me through the pandemic. So that's kind of where I'm at and where I'm coming from with this show. But I'd love it if anybody has questions or things that they want to say, even about their own experience during this time. I feel like there are a lot of people talking about what pandemic has been like for their practice, but I think there's more people who are not talking about it at all. And I find that alarming. I think this has been it's an unprecedented time that none of us have ever experienced before. And I'm still processing it and still figuring out what the different pieces are that I can collect and build something new from. I'm not one of the artists who has been able to just go on making the same things. As I've been saying, I think like thinking about what new things can be built feels really important. So, yeah, I'd love to hear if you're building something new too. Stan, yeah.
I love hearing all this. It's so many parallels in my life with the process that you've been going through, except that you've really reached out and have a community, and I think it's really awesome. I think these questions are are pretty vital, if for no other reason than things don't feel relevant anymore. Mm-hmm. The old work, all of it just does not feel even appropriate, actually. It's weird. And I also kind of got back just to making pops again, it's just like my own response. In my own work, I love doing site-specific stuff. And it used to be I'd go into a place and just be clever about it. And then all of a sudden it became more, it isn't about me at all, it's about the place and and responding to it, dreaming about it, and immersing. And that's what's happened with the pandemic, is that I felt bad that my practice just went away. It just stopped. Uh-huh. And now it's actually kind of a site-specific thing. It's like, that's what's called for right now. Just stop. Uh-huh. And I don't have any answers. So I'm just really curious. I was very curious to come today because I know that you're thinking about this stuff. Yeah. And what's going to arise out of these ashes. Uh-huh. And because I don't have a clue. And I'm wondering if people do, so that's what I wanted to hear from you. If people have a clue about this.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I feel you on that. And it's interesting how I've been able to think about it kind of looking outwards, but when I'm turning back inwards, as like the work in the show is very inwardly facing. I am working on a body of work that is the kind of successor to that body of work, but it's just been so slow. It's harder to figure out like what feels relevant in my own practice. And I think community building has always felt very relevant. I think like no matter what, that feels essential. I happen to also be super passionate about this niche of ceramics. So I'm able to build the ceramics community. And that still feels, I think any community building feels relevant, even if it's a niche community. And I think that it's sometimes easier to think about what approaches might be able to shift, but it's hard to see what the outcome of those approaches will be. But I think that's also exciting. That also has a lot of potential. And I think like there's so many things that we can lament about what was taken away during pandemic and what was really difficult. But there's also these beautiful things that have emerged from it, like these ways of being globally connected. People who I've met online, who I've never met in person, but I've been doing studio visits with her. They're leading studio sessions or state of ceramics conversations. Like we're working really closely together. Those kinds of things are really amazing. And I think it's easy for me to feel really guilty when I'm not like in the studio making something physical. And I think that's part of this thing about like valuing the offcuts of a slab of clay. Like all these things that aren't necessarily going to be made into something physical are still really important, maybe more important. So I'm trying to make sure that I'm looking at those offcuts, even when they don't really exist in a tangible form, and trying to think about what we can do with them. And I believe deeply in higher education and the university system. I'm a huge proponent of it. I've taught in it for 10 years. I hope to continue teaching in it. But I also feel like we really need alternatives, and I think the systems that we have are not accessible to a large amount of people. I think that the information that's being presented is often redundant. And we need to be looking at these other avenues of including people and presenting that information. And we need more people to help us think about what we can do differently. Yeah.
First of all, it's so grateful to be here today.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, that's going to make me nervous. Okay. You're saying things that are even bigger than I think that you realize you're saying.
Yeah.
And it's probably because it is so new. It's only been, 2019 was like the end of what we all thought we knew. So we haven't been in this place for very long. But I have been for 21 years. And for the first time, I felt like everybody was starting to see a world that I was so familiar and bubbled away from, having to be careful and all this stuff. But I have to say, your work and your vocabulary and the way you talk about, the crumbling and all that, what I experienced that long, 21 years ago, was so similar, and you sound like I'm listening to the neurologists. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is what they told me. And we would have to wait, and you literally within your body and within your brain, when you have a catastrophic event that changes your body, like from the inside out, you can't see what's there, but you have to live with that residue and then pick up all those pieces and figure out where to go. And so, you said ceramics didn't seem so important anymore. I was teaching all the time too. I could care less if I taught after that event. And I think there are a lot of us who are coming from that perspective. And maybe that's why I'm feeling such an attraction to what you're doing right now, because it's so familiar to me. And I just think, I'm just so grateful that you're opening the world to this perspective that's been suppressed for such a long time. It's, thinking about all of those fragilities has not been in the forefront of anybody's mind. It still isn't in a lot of people, who refuse to see things for what they are and be careful. So I'm excited of where you're going and what you're bringing to, the arts and education, and it's so needed. And I've been so frustrated, and so I just thank you for that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I think just thinking about the basics of clay, I think there's so much for us to learn in that way from the clay body. And, I was having a short debate recently with a friend because I was saying that I'm always talking about this reciprocal relationship that I have with clay. I press into the clay, it receives my mark, it proves that I exist because I just indented that clay. I remove my hand, it has marked me, and there's this reciprocal relationship. And the argument was that it's not reciprocal, the clay is not alive, you're personifying it. And that may be true, but I think it is kind of a proxy for the self. And there are all these things that happen in the clay body that happen in our bodies and that happen in the circumstances that uphold our bodies. And there's a lot when we really observe and slow down and look that we can actually gain from that. And so I really appreciate what you're saying about your own experience and how long this has been your experience.
I do want to say also, I have a lot of artist friends who are doing the opposite. There's an angst because they're trying so hard to continue with what they had.
Yeah.
They're aggressively making, almost like this is not going to get me down. This is not going to change it. We're going to keep it going. We're going to stay normal and all that. I just kind of feel like, just take a breath.
Yeah, it's hard to do that. It's hard to allow ourselves to actually slow down and have that space and not necessarily be productive. Kind of what Stan, you're saying, that feeling of being stuck in a way, or I said, of feeling guilty for not producing visibly or these tangible results. But I think when we really take stock of those things, we'll be better prepared to go forward with a new kind of work. Yeah, and each to their own, right? Everybody needs these different things, but I'm with you in that, I'm not excited about going back to normal. I'm much more excited about figuring out how we can move forward in a kind of different way. And I think some of those pieces come along, and it's really important. But it would be nice to take some of the weird residue of this time and use that too.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great place to.
Thanks, Beth Ann. And thank you to Beth Ann and the AMOCA team for everything.
I hope you'll all join us back in the galleries to look at the work with a new set of eyes, and enjoy the other galleries while you're here as well. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.